Welcome everyone, nice to see you again. This week we are looking at requirements lifecycle management. Let me share my screen with you and we can get stuck in. Okay. Wonderful. Great, so we are talking about requirements lifecycle management. Again, this week we will divide this knowledge area into two videos. This is part one where we will look at the first few tasks. But first, let's have a look. What is requirements lifecycle management about? So basically, this particular knowledge area describes the tasks that business analysts perform in order to manage and maintain requirements and design information from the inception to the retirement of a requirement. So basically, for the entire duration of any initiative, the requirements need to be maintained and managed. So this knowledge area will describe the tasks that you need to perform in order for this to happen effectively. So let's have a look at the tasks that's part of this knowledge area. So the first task is trace requirements. The next is maintain requirements, prioritize requirements, assess requirements changes, and approve requirements. So we will start by looking at trace requirements, and we'll cover maintain and prioritize as well in this video. And then the next part would be the last two tasks, assess requirements changes and approve requirements in the next video. Great, but let's now have a look at trace requirements. Now, I know sometimes this can be a little bit confusing to people that's starting out in business analysis. So I will do my best to try and explain the different types of traceability here so that you can understand what this is all about. So from a BABOK perspective, the purpose of trace requirements is to ensure that requirements and designs at different levels are aligned to one another and to manage the effects of change to one level on related requirements. So basically, this is then also to track the lineage of a requirement, both backwards and forwards, but also in terms of the relationships that the requirement has with other requirements. And if we do this, so why would we bother with doing tracing? So tracing requirements helps you to do a faster and simpler impact analysis if that should crop up during a project. It's also a more reliable discovery of inconsistencies and gaps in your requirements. It gives you deeper insights into the scope and complexity of a change, and it's a reliable assessment of which requirements have been addressed and which have not. So now let's have a look at two examples that is available in the BABOK guide of different types of traceability. So the first type that you can see here on the left is referred to as process traceability. That is basically when you start at a high level, the value chain, literally at the highest level of a particular business process, and you trace something down through the business process, then you trace the sub-processes related to the business process, then you track the activities related to the sub-process, and then the tasks that's related to the activity. So it's like a hierarchical tracing of the different components of a process initiative. Where in a similar way, when you look at the right-hand side, we've got the software requirements traceability. This is probably a more common one that I'm personally much more familiar with and have done a lot of. But basically, this is when you trace requirements by starting at the business needs that created those requirements in the first place. So you'll link your business requirements to specific business needs. You'll link your stakeholder requirements back to business requirements. And then you'll link your solution requirements specifically back to the stakeholder requirements that initiated them. And this could be taken further down to a design, a code, and a test level, which can be very useful if you want to prove at any stage whether a requirement has actually been successfully implemented. So these are at a very broad level, two different categories of traceability, but this is not an exhaustive list, and these principles can be applied across different ways and for different purposes. But let's have a look at specific elements that make up this task. So the elements within this particular technique, or my apologies, in this particular task, is the level of formality, the relationships, and traceability repository. So these are the aspects that you need to consider when you look at doing some traceability for your requirements. Let's quickly run through each of these to understand what they mean. So level of formality, element 1, this is basically where you have to determine what value a particular type of traceability or link will bring to the particular initiative. You don't want to find yourself tracing requirements in all these different ways just because you enjoy working with that level of detail. We are actually here needing to think about what is the real point of doing tracing, what value will it bring to the work we're doing. And secondly, you need to keep in mind that the bigger your initiative becomes, the more formal you'll have to be if you want to do tracing. Because whatever tracing you end up choosing to use need to be manageable and scalable in a way that you can manage it. Otherwise, it gets very, very complicated and becomes a real beast to try and manage. So these are two important things to think about before you start with your tracing. Now, the second element, and this is where there are different types of traceability, and I'll discuss each of these briefly with you. So essentially, we've got 4 different types. The first type is what we refer to as derived traceability. This is when there's traceability between 2 requirements, when one requirement is derived from another. So a solution requirement might be derived from a stakeholder requirement. So that would be also similar to what I showed to you a few slides back on the diagram on the right. Then the next type of traceability is depends. So this is also between 2 requirements, and it's when the one requirement actually depends on another requirement. And this particular type of traceability can then be further broken down into necessity and effort. With necessity, this is really just saying the relationship we have between these 2 requirements, the one is dependent on the other. So they need each other. And then the effort subcategory here is about the level of effort or ease that would exist. If you implemented requirement A, it makes sense from an effort perspective to also implement requirement B. That is an effort-related relationship. So then if we look at the third major category, we look at satisfy. So satisfy is a relationship between an implementation element and the requirements that it's satisfying. So for example, when we implement a recruitment module as part of an ERP solution, it satisfies our requirements related to recruitment. So that would be a satisfy type of traceability. Now, the last type of traceability is also quite common, especially in the software world, and that's validate. So this is basically the relationship between a requirement and a test case or another element that will be validating that the requirement has actually been fulfilled. So these are the 4 main categories, and it's worth spending a bit of time to understand what they mean and think back to work that you would have done in the past and how you could have, or perhaps you did, do some traceability. Okay, now let's look at the last element. So this is about the traceability repository. Now, in the, should I say, old days, we used to just use MS Excel. So for small projects, that would still make sense. You can do your traceability with something as simple as a spreadsheet. However, these days, you probably want to look at slightly more sophisticated tools like Jira, for example, where you can much easier trace your requirements back all the way through to implementation elements like test cases. So think about what tools you can use, and then you think carefully about what it is you want to trace, why you want to trace it, and what value will it bring, and then implement it accordingly. All right, excellent. So now let's jump straight into the task, maintain requirements, and have a quick look at what this task is all about. So the maintain requirements task, the purpose according to the BABOK is to retain requirement accuracy and consistency throughout and beyond the change during the entire requirements life cycle, and to support reuse of requirements in other solutions. All right, so the elements is maintain requirements, maintain attributes, and reusing requirements. So let's have a look at maintain requirements, element 1. So this is just simply about keeping your requirements accurate throughout the life cycle. So make sure that stakeholders can get access to your requirements, make sure they're all very clearly labeled and easy to navigate around and up to date. So maintain relationships. So if you do have your traceability in place, make sure that you keep that maintained as well. And also, it's the better you can trace your requirements or at least keep contextual information around, the better it would be in terms of understanding at a later stage what was driving a particular requirements need or a need for a requirement. So maintenance is actually a very important thing and also a very easy thing to neglect. So let's have a look at the maintain attributes. What's the difference here? So the attributes are basically information about the requirements. So this could include things like the source of the requirement, the priority of the requirement, the complexity of the requirement, and there would be other attributes as well. But essentially, it's about maintaining these attributes about a particular requirement, because that helps tremendously in the management of the requirement. So you can imagine that a requirement statement might not change, but the status or the source or the priority may change during the life cycle of the project. So maintain attributes is about keeping an eye on those particular important pieces of information as well. All right, and then the last element, this is about reusing requirements. So in a general sense, higher level of abstraction lends itself more to being reused. So the more general a requirement is, the easier it is to use it again in future. So you can reuse requirements in a variety of different situations. It could be in the current initiative, it could be in similar initiatives in your company or your department or through the entire organization. And example candidates requirements for reuse is like regulatory requirements that every project might have to adhere to, data privacy requirements, policy requirements, usability requirements, and reporting requirements. So these types of requirements are the ones that often applies to all projects or all systems that is being implemented in a particular organization. So it's really worth spending a bit of time developing repositories with these types of requirements so that you can simply reuse them when you move between initiatives. Okay, so that's in a nutshell what maintain requirements is all about. Now let's have a look at the third task, which is prioritize requirements. So as you can imagine, the purpose of this particular task is to rank requirements in order of relative importance. Quite an interesting activity throughout the life cycle, because we all have a different view as to what could be important. However, let's have a look at what this actually entails from an elements perspective. So one of the first elements of prioritization is about, let's talk about the basis for prioritization. We'll have a look at what some of the challenges are, and you might be familiar with some of those, and then the continual prioritization element and what that means. So now let's just briefly run through the basis for prioritization. There are many different things that could have an impact on how you choose to do your prioritization. And this may shift as you go through your initiative. But initially, if you consider things like the benefit, this is normally one of the big reasons why you would have a requirement as part of your initiative, because that requirement may promise to give the business a lot of value. So the benefit might be really an important driver for which requirements will be implemented first. Penalty, this is all about, could we suffer a penalty if we don't implement a particular requirement? And this could often happen in compliance-related projects. Cost. Here people might say, okay, we won't be implementing requirements that's excessively expensive, or the cost basically plays a role as to where it sits within the priority list. Risk. Risk could be simply, if we implemented a particular requirement, what is the risk that something could go wrong? And this will also have quite a big sway if there's a big risk in terms of how this requirement gets prioritized. Dependencies. This is about two requirements needing to be implemented together that cannot be implemented apart. And that is where dependencies might drive for requirement A to be on the priority list with requirement B, because they can't be implemented separately. Time sensitivity. Now, this is simply a matter of, if you miss a particular date for a particular requirement, you will in fact lose the benefit of that requirement. So an example could be, if there was a certain deadline for a vendor to release a particular product into the market, and your company needed to have some solution in place to deal with what's going to happen beyond that date, then all the requirements that needs that solution to be in place successfully would be time sensitive. So you would use time sensitivity as a basis for putting that requirement up at the top of the list. Stability is about how mature is the requirement. So how stable is the requirement? Often some of the requirements might just be nice ideas or not very well developed yet. So those requirements might be the ones that's decided to put at the bottom of the priority list until they reach a more stable status or they become more mature. And then, like I also said, I've mentioned the penalty basis to be related to regulatory or policy compliance. Penalties could be other reasons as well, other types of penalties, but regulatory or policy compliance is often a priority, a basis for prioritization. But now keep in mind that in most cases, these factors would all have a place within the prioritization discussion. It's unlikely that you would ever have a situation where prioritization is based on only one of these factors. In most cases, it is a combination of a number of factors. And it's worth knowing what those combinations are so that you could have some kind of framework to work through when you do run prioritization workshops. So element 2 is about the challenges. And partly it's because those basis items that we've just discussed, some people may value some of those particular aspects more highly than other aspects. And this is where the challenges come in. Like for one business stakeholder, the business value of a particular requirement is potentially all that matters. Whereas for another stakeholder, the risk of implementing that requirement is way too high because they are responsible for the area that the risk is in. So the risk basis would be a much stronger decision point for them in terms of prioritization. So it is really quite, with stakeholders, they could find it quite hard to say something is of low priority because of these different perspectives they have, and they each have their own KPIs and different things that they have to keep in mind. So it might require some trade-offs. And as long as you're aware of the fact that these things might crop up, and if you understand the importance of trying to find some framework to do prioritization with, it could help a lot with getting through some of these issues. And just to step back way to week 1, the BA approach and planning we did, there was also discussion about what will be the basis for prioritization and how will you manage these types of things. So this is just delving into more detail around that. Okay, and then the final element is continual prioritization. So like I mentioned in the beginning, there is a chance that priorities or the way that we prioritize change during the initiative. In the beginning, it's all about the business value. Let's focus on that. So we want to get the biggest bang for our buck. But then as we go through the project, when the implementation teams start having to implement some of these solutions, there may be other things that would change the priority in how things will be delivered, simply because some aspects might be more complicated than others to deliver, or whatever the implementation constraints might be. And these types of aspects will then shift prioritization in terms of which requirements get implemented first, coming from an implementation perspective. So prioritization is quite a living thing that will always be part of the initiative and the discussion of how things are done and what happens. Keep your eye on the ball basically around prioritization and see if you could steer some of the prioritization discussions in a way that will help the project or initiative succeed. Okay, so over to you. We've covered these 3 tasks quite quickly, but I think a lot of it is things that you've probably had some exposure to and you work with. So if you've got any burning questions about these, please raise them in the Facebook group. We are all there to support each other, and we are there to share discussions. And as I said, way in week 1, I certainly don't know everything, and you may really get a lot of benefit if you start asking questions in the Facebook group, because we've got some fantastic experts in there who's been very, very kind, and they've been giving us a lot of great input. So please think about some of the examples you maybe have done in your career that could be of benefit to others, and anything that you think we need to be mindful of in terms of the exam for these 3 tasks. Right, so that's in a nutshell. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have got some good ideas around what traceability is all about, prioritization and maintenance. I look forward to speaking with you during the next session.